A teenage girl gets dragged up a wall and across the ceiling by something nobody else can see, and it is still the most disturbing death Freddy Krueger ever delivered. She never did anything wrong, she just grew up on a street where the adults had a secret worth burying. Decades of sequels chased that same fear and never quite got it back. Tina Gray. A teenage girl gets dragged up a bedroom wall and across the ceiling by something nobody else in the room can see, and it happens 40 years ago in the very first kill of the entire franchise. Nothing after it tops it. Not the one-liners, not the video game cameos, not the razor glove merchandise. The scariest thing Freddy Krueger ever did, he did before he cracked a single joke. That is not nostalgia talking. That is the actual shape of the problem. Tina Gray dies in Wes Craven's original A Nightmare on Elm Street, released November 9th, 1984, and she does not go quietly. She is slashed by claws that leave gashes with no hands attached to them, hoisted off her feet, and dragged up the wall of Nancy's bedroom like gravity simply clocked out for the night. Then, she gets pulled across the ceiling directly above her boyfriend Rod, spraying blood down onto the bed while he stands there frozen, watching a killer. He cannot see murder, the girl he loves, right above his head. That detail matters more than the special effects. Rod is a witness to a murder with no murderer visible. He gets blamed for it. He gets arrested for it. A kid loses his girlfriend and his freedom in the same night. And the actual killer never even has to show his face to make it happen. Because the actual killer is Freddy Krueger, a child murderer who spent years killing kids on Elm Street in Springwood, Ohio, roughly 20 of them, before the parents of that neighborhood tracked him down and burned him alive rather than let the courts handle it. Freddy does not come back as a ghost or a zombie. He comes back as something that only exists once you close your eyes, which means the one place every human being on Earth has to eventually go, sleep, is now hunting ground. Tina's death is the moment that rule gets established for the audience and for the characters at the same time. Nancy and her friends realize this thing does not climb through windows or hide in closets. It waits until you dream, and then it does whatever it wants to your body while you are unconscious and defenseless. The effect itself was built practically, using a rotating set piece that let the crew film Tina walking on what was actually the floor while the camera made it read as the ceiling. No CGI, no shortcuts, just a genuinely disorienting piece of stagecraft that still holds up better than plenty of modern horror. Fans have ranked this kill at the top of the franchise for decades, and the reason is not the technical trick. It is that Freddy never says a word. He does not quip. He just kills a teenage girl who was punished for a crime she did not commit, buried under her own parents' silence about who Freddy really was and why he came for their street. But this version of Freddy, silent, invisible, killing only in dreams, didn't even survive one sequel. The very next film would drag him out of the dream world entirely and hand him the one thing that should have made him more terrifying, but somehow made everything weirder. Jesse Walsh. Freddy Krueger's biggest rule was the reason he worked at all. He could only touch you when your eyes were closed. Barely a year after that rule made him a horror icon, the franchise threw it out completely. Jesse Walsh moves into the house on Elm Street and immediately starts losing control of his own body. Not his mind, his body. Freddy does not just haunt his dreams anymore. He starts climbing out of them and using Jesse as a suit. The original film worked because the threat had a border. Sleep was the wall, and once that wall goes down, the entire concept underneath the franchise goes down with it. By the pool party, Freddy is not lurking in a nightmare waiting for someone to close their eyes. He is standing in broad daylight, physically manifesting, attacking guests in front of everyone. Coach Schneider gets it worse. Dragged into the school shower, stripped and snapped with a towel by an unseen force before Freddy finishes the job, all while Jesse's body is the thing doing the killing. This is not a dream kill. This is Freddy operating a real human being like a puppet in a real location, and the movie wants you to feel exactly how wrong that is. And the film does not just tell you Jesse is losing himself, it shows you in the ugliest way it can manage. Freddy's face pushes out through Jesse's torso like something trying to be born wrong. His hand splits open, and the glove bursts out from underneath the skin. Together with the 2 pool party deaths and Coach Schneider, that brings the franchise's confirmed on-screen total to 12 kills across just the first 2 films. And a solid chunk of them happen because a teenager cannot stop something from wearing him. That is worse than getting murdered by a stranger in a dream you can eventually wake up from. It's your own hands doing it. Fans have argued for decades over whether this movie breaks the series or just bends it somewhere interesting. The possession angle throws out the sleep rule that made the original terrifying, and plenty of people call that a mistake dressed up as an experiment. But it also gave the franchise its most enduring subtext. Jesse's fight to keep Freddy out of his body reads to a huge number of viewers as a fight to keep something else hidden, a metaphor for repressed identity that critics and fans still dissect. Nothing in the film says this outright, but the imagery keeps pointing the same direction, and the reading has held for decades because it fits too well to be an accident. Either way, the cost is the same one every Elm Street kid pays. Jesse never asked for any of this. He just wanted a normal year in a new house, and instead he spent it fighting to stay the one thing driving his own arms. Reinvention number 1 didn't stick either. So for the next 2 films, Freddy tried on a completely new personality. He started talking, cracking jokes, and turning his murders into elaborate set pieces, and that's where one victim's death got so famous that people still argue about who actually died in it. Debbie Stevens. You think you remember this kill. Roach spray in one hand, TV remote in the other, Freddy grinning through the static. You don't. Ask any casual fan how Debbie Stevens died, and most of them will say the same wrong thing. They'll tell you she got sucked into a television screen screaming while Freddy delivered the most quoted line in slasher history. That kill happened. It just didn't happen to her. Welcome to Prime Time. Bitch belongs to Jennifer Caulfield, crushed headfirst into a TV set a full year earlier in Dream Warriors. Debbie Stevens doesn't even exist yet when that line gets delivered. She shows up in The Dream Master, released August 19th, 1988, in a completely different sequence with a completely different gag. Freddy doesn't touch a television anywhere near her. He turns her into a cockroach and crushes her inside a roach motel, which is somehow both a pest control product and a murder weapon in the same breath. 2 different women, 2 different years, 2 different deaths, and somehow the internet mashed them into one. That mix-up isn't just sloppy fandom trivia, it's proof of something the franchise did to itself. Dream Warriors alone banked 6 confirmed kills, the TV death among the most iconic, and by the time Debbie dies in the 4th film, Freddy's total body count across the saga has climbed past 20. Every one of those kills got a prop, a punchline, and a production budget. Somewhere in that pileup, a girl who wanted nothing more than to survive high school got turned into vermin for a sight gag, and audiences were too busy laughing to clock which death was which. That's the turning point people miss. The primetime line wasn't just a joke, it was the moment Freddy stopped being a monster and became a personality. Dark one-liners paired with elaborate props, kill after kill, until the props became the point, and the victims became furniture. Jennifer got the television, Debbie got the bug spray. Somebody down the line got a bed that ate them, and audiences kept clapping because the kills kept getting weirder, never because they kept getting scarier. Nobody was tracking a body count anymore. They were tracking a gag reel, one increasingly elaborate death after another, each one designed to top the last instead of terrify harder than the last. Compare that to the ceiling. One boy, one room. Blood defying gravity while his friends screamed downstairs, powerless to stop something they couldn't even see happening. Nobody forgets who died in that scene or how. Nobody's mixing that one up in a comment section a decade later, arguing about which movie it was even from. But hand the franchise a few sequels in a bug motel, and suddenly, even the fans can't keep the body count straight. That's not devotion to detail slipping. That's the cost of turning a nightmare into a variety show, one gimmick at a time, until the gimmicks are all anybody remembers. By the 4th film, Freddy isn't haunting anyone's memory of fear anymore. He's haunting their memory of jokes. And jokes are a lot easier to misfile than trauma. A punchline blends into the next punchline. A scream doesn't. Ask someone to describe the ceiling death, and they'll get every detail right without even trying. Ask them to describe the Roach Motel, and half of them will swap in a television by mistake because somewhere along the way, the franchise trained its own audience to remember the prop instead of the person. But somewhere in that same movie, the franchise finally stumbled onto an answer it hadn't tried yet. Not another kid who screams and runs until the credits roll, but one who turns around, stops playing victim in someone else's game, and starts building weapons of her own inside the only place Freddy thought he was untouchable. Alice Johnson. For the first time in this franchise, somebody fights back and actually wins, not survives, not outlasts. Wins, in the way you'd want a superhero to win, and that alone makes Alice Johnson the strangest thing to happen to Elm Street since a burned man started cracking jokes. By 1988, Freddy had already carved through dozens of teenagers across the series, a body count built on kids who never stood a chance. Alice changes the math, the premise sounds almost too simple. Alice is the quiet one, the girl who watches her friends die one by one, and in most slasher movies that role ends in a scream and an end credit. Instead, something transfers. Every friend Freddy kills leaves something behind in her, a piece of themselves she absorbs the moment they die in her dreams. Grief becomes inventory. By the film's midpoint, she is not running from Freddy anymore. She is fighting him, and fighting him well. She throws punches with a dead friend's martial arts training. She moves with a dead friend's reflexes. She bends the dream itself the way a dead friend once could, reshaping hallways and rooftops like she is the one holding the pen now instead of him. This is a final girl with a moveset. Fans have called her the closest thing the franchise ever produced to an actual superhero, and it is hard to argue. Nobody before her fought back with a growing arsenal like this. Nobody after her quite matched it either. Some of that praise comes with a raised eyebrow. Plenty of longtime viewers think the power inheritance gimmick drags a horror franchise a bit too close to a comic book, and that debate has never fully settled. But the pattern holds up on its own. Alice is not lucky. She is built, kill by kill, out of the very deaths that should have destroyed her. That build pays off in the climax, and it is the one moment in 6 films where Freddy's own math turns on him. Alice does not beat him with a weapon. She recites a nursery rhyme, holds up a mirror, and shows Freddy every single soul he has ever murdered, all of them staring back at once. The dead children he burned for decades before he was ever a dream demon. The teenagers bleeding out across the past 3 films, they do not just watch, they rise up and tear him apart with their bare hands, using his own victim count as the weapon that finally kills him. Think about what that actually means for a second. The franchise spent 3 movies stacking bodies, and here that stack stops being a scoreboard and becomes a small army. Every kill you sat through, every name and face gets repurposed into the thing that ends him. It is the one time this series admits its victims deserved a say in how the story finished. Of course, none of this happens because Freddy got weaker on his own. It happens because the story needed Alice to get stronger, borrowing power from the dead just to keep the fight interesting, which quietly says more about where this villain was standing by 1988 than any on-screen kill count could. Alice comes back the following year, still carrying that same advantage. Still the one person in the neighborhood who can walk into a nightmare and not immediately lose. But powering up a hero can only stretch a villain's menace so far before the audience notices what is missing. So, for the chapter that got sold as the end of the road, the writer stopped looking for a stronger dreamer and started looking for someone connected to Freddy by blood, someone whose reason for wanting him dead went back further than any of these fights, and that choice was about to rewrite exactly what kind of monster he had been all along. Maggie Burrow cures? The thing that finally kills Freddy Krueger in the original timeline is not a hero, a cop, or a kid with a homemade weapon. It is his own daughter. That is not a metaphor. In 1991's final chapter of the original saga, the woman hunting Freddy Krueger is revealed to be Catherine Krueger, renamed Maggie Burrows, his biological child. Freddy is not just her monster, he is her father, which means the franchise just turned its boogeyman into somebody's dad. The obvious version everyone remembers is simple. Freddy Krueger, child killer, burned alive by furious parents, comes back as a dream demon. That version worked fine for 4 movies straight. Nobody needed more backstory than that to be scared of him. It was clean, it was mythic, and it did not require a family tree. This one adds a wife he murdered and a daughter he terrorized before the town ever lit the match, and suddenly the monster has a home address. The numbers alone are brutal. At least 20 children dead at his hands while he was still human, still walking around with a job and an address before anyone called him the Springwood Slasher. That is not a rumor or a courtroom exaggeration. That is the body count the franchise commits to as fact. Maggie grows up not remembering any of it, blocks it out completely, and spends her adult life piecing together fragments until she learns the man who scarred an entire town shares her last name. She is not avenging strangers. She is confronting the exact abuse that broke her own childhood, which lines her up next to every teenager on Elm Street who inherited a war they never started, except her inheritance came with his blood in her veins. The confrontation itself uses actual psychology, not just a bigger knife or a louder scream. Maggie trains in dream suppression and recall, walks into Freddy's own nightmare, and forces him to sit through the truth of who he is to her. Then she drags him into the waking world and detonates him with explosives. Loud, physical, final. No poetry, no last one-liner, just a father in pieces. Fans have argued for over 3 decades about whether that ending actually lands, or whether blowing up your own dad with dynamite is a strange note to end a horror icon's story on. And this is the part that undercuts the whole plan. Every gimmick before this one, the jokes, the video game cameos, the superhero team-ups, all tried to make Freddy bigger, louder, more marketable. This movie tries the opposite. It tries to make him smaller, more explainable, more human, on the theory that giving him a family and a past would somehow restore what all those punchlines had drained away. It does not work the way they hoped. A killer with no reason is terrifying precisely because you cannot negotiate with him, cannot diagnose him, cannot fix him. A killer with a wife he strangled and a daughter he traumatized is tragic, is explicable, is almost pitiable. That is a completely different monster, and it is a weaker one. Fear needs mystery, and mystery is exactly what a birth certificate and a family photo destroy. The franchise spent years trying to get its monster feared again, and the fix they landed on was to hand him a backstory sympathetic enough that the audience started asking what happened to him instead of what he was going to do next. So the original timeline ends there. Freddy humanized, exposed, and blown to pieces by his own blood. Case closed, chapter finished, monster retired, or so everyone assumed at the time. A demon that could survive fire, dream logic, and a dozen sequels finally went down to a woman with a backpack full of dynamite in a childhood she never asked for. But almost 2 decades later, somebody looked at that ending and asked the one question the franchise had been circling since the very first burn victim screamed on Elm Street. What happens if you strip out every one-liner, every glove pun, every dream world set piece, and force people to sit with exactly what kind of man Freddy Krueger actually was, with absolutely nothing left to laugh at? Nancy Holbrook, 13 victims. That's the reboot's entire count, and it's the smallest body of work Freddy ever produced on screen. 12 people, 7 women, and 5 men, plus 1 animal, all delivered with the kind of restraint the character had not shown in 26 years, no glove pins, no one-liners before a kill. Just a former preschool groundskeeper named Fred Krueger, accused of molesting the children in his care, burned alive by the parents who covered it up rather than let it reach a courtroom. Nancy Holbrook does not remember any of it happening to her. That is the entire engine of the film. Her drawings are strange, her sleep is worse, and her friends are dying in ways that only make sense once her repressed memories start surfacing as actual evidence. She is quieter than the original Nancy, more withdrawn, more inclined to sketch a nightmare than talk about it. And every piece of art on her wall turns out to be a clue she drew, without knowing what she was documenting. The cover-up her parents' generation built to protect themselves becomes the exact thing that gets her friends killed one by one, each death dragging a buried secret closer to the surface. Her final fight happens in a dream that is actively collapsing into the real world, the two spaces bleeding into each other until neither one is safe anymore. She corners Freddy and cuts his throat, then physically drags his body out of the dream and into reality, where he is supposed to die like anyone else with a slit throat. For one scene, it genuinely looks like the franchise finally ended him for good. Then the stinger hits, Freddy is back, and he drives a blade through Nancy's mother in the film's last few seconds. Alive again, still hunting, still owed a body count that never really closes. Compare that to Alice inheriting his nightmare arsenal, Maggie inheriting his own memories, and the pattern gets uncomfortable fast. Every version of this story ends with a young woman paying for a debt her parents ran up. Nancy Holbrook is just the version where the debt is spelled out instead of implied. And it turns out audiences did not actually want it spelled out. That is the criticism that follows the reboot everywhere it's discussed. Fans call this version of Freddy less mythic and more upsetting, a shift from urban legend to something that plays closer to a true crime case file. Nancy Holbrook herself gets picked apart, some calling her a legitimate reinvention, others calling her underwritten next to the original. But the divide itself is the tell. Nobody argued this hard about whether Dream Warrior's Freddy was scary. They argued about whether he was funny enough. That is the whole arc laid bare. Wes Craven's original killer worked because he was a monster hiding behind a child's nightmare logic, and that alone put audiences through 6 sleepless sequels. The franchise then spent film after film sanding down the horror until Freddy was cracking jokes over corpses, a horror icon slowly rebuilt into a stand-up act with a glove. The reboot tried to reverse 2 decades of punchlines in one film, stripped every joke, every prop gag, every wink to camera, and rebuilt him as exactly what he always technically was. A predator, real, patient, and grotesquely human, and it worked. That's the part nobody wants to sit with. It worked so well that people could not enjoy watching it. Turns out you cannot have both. A Freddy scary enough to actually disturb you is a Freddy nobody wants playing in the background at a Halloween party. The character got funnier precisely as he got safer, and safer is the one thing the original Nightmare never was. He wasn't scariest with the glove, the one-liners, or the mythology built up around him over 9 films. He was scariest for about 90 minutes in 1984, before anyone in the audience had learned it was allowed to laugh. And every sequel after that was really just teaching them how. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.